Hello everyone, my name is Giulia Zerbini and I'm a postdoc researcher at the Department of Medical Psychology and Sociology, University of Augsburg in Germany. And the talk today will be about the influence of school sleeping times on sleep, well-being and grades. Before we start, I would like to explain a couple of things about how sleep is regulated and how can we measure sleep in the field. So there are two processes that are involved in the regulation of sleep. One process is called the homeostatic process, and it describes how sleep pressure increases during the day and then dissipates at night when we sleep. The other process is called the circadian process and is regulated by the circadian clock. Circadian clock regulates many biological rhythms in our body, among which the sleep-wake cycle. And the circadian clock promotes wakefulness during the day and sleep at night. And it is the interaction of these two processes that will then determine when we sleep. So when the sleep pressure is high enough and when the circadian clock opens up a sleep window, then we can fall asleep. Important also to mention is how the circadian clock synchronizes to the external light-dark cycle. It uses light as a time cue to know exactly when outside is day and night and to regulate accordingly all the physiology of our body. And we call this process entrainment. How can we measure sleep? We can do it in different ways. We can measure EEG activity during sleep. We can measure the rest activity patterns by using so-called active watches, but we can also use simple questionnaires, as for example the Munich Chronotype questionnaire. This is a questionnaire that asks about sleep times on workdays and on free days separately, and that I've been using a lot in my studies, because one can assess very easily sleep times and sleep duration and other information about sleep in many people with little costs. And one thing that we can measure is the so-called chronotype. So what is chronotype? Assume someone is sleeping between midnight and 8 a.m. We can define the midpoint of sleep as being 4 a.m. in this case, and we can measure this for workdays and work-free days. We can ask this then many different people, and we can plot the data as follows. So we can plot the mid-sleep on free days of many different respondents. And in this case, about 22,000 of the respondents had a mid-sleep on free days at 4 a.m. But as you can see, there is a huge variation in sleep times. We go from people sleeping very early to people sleeping very late. And this is also exactly what we call and what we define as being chronotype. So early chronotypes would sleep very early, late chronotypes would sleep very late, and then we have everything in between. So it's a continuous. And I would like here to be a bit more precise, because chronotype is not always simply equal to the midpoint of sleep on free days. If your sleep duration on free days is longer than the sleep duration on work days, we need to apply a little correction for this oversleep on free days, which is typical of people that have early social schedules, for example, need to go to school or to work very early, and then they will sleep too little during the week, working week, and then will have to catch up for the sleep on free days. But these are just details. Now I would like to go on with some other factors that influence chronotype, or better, we know that chronotype varies with different factors, and one of these, which is particularly interesting for people living in Spain, is longitude. So here you can see data still from the German population like before, and you can see how chronotype delays with longitude. It delays going from east to west. So in Eastern Germany, people sleep earlier than in Western Germany. And this is very similar to how dawn times delay, because dawn times delay by 4 minutes for each 1 degree longitude. So if we go from the very eastern part of Germany the sun will rise at a certain time, and then it will rise 36 minutes later if we go to the very west part of Germany. So with this study, it was shown that we actually follow sun time rather than social time. And this is particularly relevant for Spain, which is farther west compared to Germany, but still in the same time zone as Germany. So you can imagine that Spanish people will indeed sleep much later, which is what we know. There are, of course, cultural differences involved, but here you have also a more biological explanation why this is the case. But now I would like to move on with the topic of today. How do adolescents sleep, and how does that relate to school starting times? So we know that adolescents sleep later than adults. You can see here in this graph how chronotype delays markedly during adolescence and then becomes progressively again earlier during the adult life. But we also know that not only chronotype delays, but also that adolescents in general need longer sleep. The American Association of Pediatrics recommended 9 to 10 hours of sleep per night. So in general, high school students are late chronotypes, but of course also among high school students there is an inter-individual variation. This is what you see in this picture. These are different students with different circadian clocks, but they have to write, for example, the same exam at 9 a.m. in the morning. And so you see how some students are doing just fine. They are probably the early chronotypes, but you also see how some students are still very sleepy, and they are probably late chronotypes who are still in the middle of their biological night. So you can already imagine how chronotype might affect school performance. And this is what we and other researchers showed, namely that on average, late chronotypes obtain lower grades. So here the scale, this study was done in the Netherlands. It goes from 0 to 10, with 0 being the worst possible grade and 10 the best possible grade. So you see how late chronotypes on average achieve lower grades. But this has been shown in many different studies, many different countries. So it's a quite stable and robust result. What we actually also showed was that this chronotype effect on grades is stronger in the morning. So there is a time of day effect as well, and they interact. So here you can see how the early chronotypes, the black bars, obtain indeed better grades in the morning. But if we test students in the early afternoon, this chronotype effect disappears completely. So that was the first suggestion we gave to schools. If you cannot delay your school starting times, maybe you could just schedule the exams later in the day. What we also found was that the chronotype effect on grades is particularly strong for scientific subjects, whereas for humanistic and linguistic subjects, it seems to not matter that much if you are a late or an early chronotype. And we also found that late chronotypes are more often absent from class. So late chronotypes arrive more often late, are more often dismissed from class, and are also more often sick. So altogether, these studies showed that late chronotypes obtain lower grades, especially when tested in the morning, and also when tested in scientific subjects. And that late chronotypes also are more often absent from class. So now the question is that then a problem only for late chronotypes, the early school starting times? Well, actually not, because many studies have shown that every adolescent sleeps too little. So you see here how sleep duration decreases markedly with the increasing age during adolescence. But even the 11, 12 years old students get on average 8.4 hours of sleep, which is not close to the 9 to 10 hours recommendation of the American Pediatric Association. So early school starting times are a problem for all students, but of course, especially the late chronotypes are the ones who suffer the most. And what is the problem when students sleep too little? What do we know about that? Well, there are a lot of studies showing detrimental effects for health and performance when people in general sleep too little, and more related to schools. Studies found that students who sleep too little obtain lower grades, have worse concentration, lower mood, there is more violence and bullyism, there is a higher risk to start smoking or consuming alcohol, and there are more car accidents. So too little sleep is for sure not good. So how can we change that? Well, one of the obvious solutions was indeed to delay school starting times, and that's what many schools now have done, but still not enough. And there are also a lot of studies that have followed these changes in school starting times. And what did they found? Well, a lot of good results, positive results in terms of health and performance. So students sleep longer if they are allowed to go to school later. They are less tired in class. They feel better concentrated. They are in a better mood. There are less car accidents. Students also attend more class. And about grades, there are for now mixed results, so we need more studies. But I think we have enough evidence to support later school starting times. And there are, of course, also other possibilities. One would be to have flexible starting times. I was lucky enough to be involved in a project that was run by Eva Binevik from the University of Munich. They followed a school that introduced a flexible starting times where students could choose daily whether they were going to school at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. And what they found, and what is depicted here, is that when students could go to school at 9 a.m., they would sleep 1 hour longer. Interestingly, they would keep the same sleep onset. So one of the biggest worry here is that students, if they are allowed to go to school later, they would delay their sleep onset as well. But here was not the case, and these results were kept also after 1 year. So in general, late school starting times are good, but I think it's also very important to tell students about the importance of sleep and that they should take care of their sleep. And we have learned in the beginning of this talk how light is important for the circadian clock and for the regulation of sleep. So there is this rule of thumb, how can we use light to improve our sleep? Well, morning natural light is particularly beneficial because it wakes you up, makes you feel alert, and makes you sure you sleep early. Whereas evening artificial light should be avoided because it disturbs your sleep, makes you feel alert, and delays your sleep. So altogether, I would say later school starting times are good, but as I said, students should know about the importance of sleep and how they can take care of their sleep. And with that, I would like to acknowledge, to thank all the people that were involved in these studies that I presented today, and you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. In the meantime, I would like to thank you again for a very interesting presentation. I think I would like to ask you. Well, I could ask you many things, but I would like to ask you from your perspective, because of the case of Spain, as you have already mentioned, we are very much in Western Europe, very much in the West, and we are also with the same Central European hour, like Germany. but the sun here comes probably about 1 hour, hour and a half later than in Germany. And this is something I have felt myself when we talk with the teachers, and then they ask you, for example, no, but what time do they enter in Finland or in Estonia to school? And you say, well, they may enter at 8 o'clock in the morning, but maybe 8 o'clock in the morning in Finland and Estonia, even when they are 1 hour less than Central Europe, is still not so early as it is 9 in the morning in Spain, no, at least for the summer hour, no. And I would like to whether there is a specific data on this effect on countries which are very much on the border of the time zone, which is not their own.
Yeah, so you're wondering whether countries or better cities at the border of the time zone, but the problem is mainly when they are the western part of the time zone, because the sun, as you said, rises later, and so there are, let's say, problems in terms of sleep, because they sleep later, but then schools, for example, start at the same time as in the eastern part. So that would be one consideration. And there have been already also studies about health in general, because we know how sleep is important for health. And then there are some studies showing that there are increased risks for certain diseases when you live in the western part of the time zone.
Okay, so it affects, of course, as you said, not only grade and concentration, but it affects also health and health habits and lifestyle, no? And of course, together with absenteeism. There is a question in the chat by Harry Claire. You would like to connect the micro? In case he...
Yes.
Yeah, please.
Go Hello. Hi. I enjoyed all talks, but I have a question about interrupted sleep. We know interrupted sleep affects health. We know in adults it could also cause some neurological issues and so on, and comorbidities. What about children? Interrupted sleep, children that assume that they have the allotted 9 hours or 10 hours, but in fact, they don't. Has anybody looked at this? Has this been researched at all? Do you know? Does anybody know? That's my question.
There is a good question. I have to say, usually the focus is on sleep duration. I'm not sure what is the prevalence of interrupted sleep in young people. Because, of course, interrupted sleep is a problem mainly in older people. And so I'm not aware of studies that have looked specifically at interrupted sleep. Actually, of course, there are all these studies that have used also actigraphy, which is, let's say, a more objectively way to look at sleep. But they always report the sleep duration as main parameter to then look at the effects on grades, for example.
Thank you. Okay, great.
Hello. Sure. Hello. Speaking of sleep, it's very early here, but I was wondering about the current move towards virtual learning that we're experiencing in the United States due to the pandemic, and the number of whether or not you know of any studies that are looking at sleep effects of being able to engage in classroom activity from home via computers, via virtual learning during this pandemic over the past year. We're starting to see that, and whether or not anyone has looked at how that's affected sleep for adolescents in school.
Yeah, that's also a very interesting question, and I'm sure there will be soon studies on this. I'm only aware of studies that have looked at adults, not young adolescents, and how the fact that they are more at home, so doing home office, how that affects their sleep. And because the main problem that we have is when you have to start early, too early for your chronotype. And so if you now do home office and you're more flexible in your starting hours, that results in better sleep or people, so these studies, some have been already published, and I was part of another workshop. So the main result is that people sleep longer, especially on work days, and that another phenomenon that is called social jet lag, which is the difference between your sleep on work days and on free days. When this is too big, this difference, it means that you are not really in synchro with the social time. So between your biological clock and your social clock, there is no synchrony. And this is also reduced. So apparently, home office and these more flexible hours, at least for adults, are good. But I'm not aware of studies that have already looked at children and how that impacts their learning abilities. And I'm not even sure whether school schedules have changed. You know, if the school was starting at 8, I can imagine school started still at 8 also with the virtual learning, but I'm not aware of that. I'm not sure. Maybe there are parents that know that here.
Thank you very much. I would like also to ask you regarding this phenomena what you were explaining before of the social jet lag. Because in some discussions, sometimes it appears that, or even some books, no, who give tips on how to improve the sleep. They sometimes gave these tips that you may try to force yourself also to wake up early on the weekends, no, to avoid the social jet lag. That it will, it's bad because later on Monday you have it more difficulty to wake up because you have, in a sense, allow yourself to sleep too long over the weekend. And my perception, I'm not a specialist on chronobiology, maybe you can clarify me a bit more this issue. I have the feeling that what you do really in the weekend is to catch up the stars on what you have not been able to get during the week. So I think the recommendation should not be try to wake up also early in the weekend, but try to recover at least on the weekend what is your more synchronized sleep and whatever deficit you have. And maybe try to, you know, during the work days and try to make your social commitments to better adapt to your chronobiology, right? Would you agree with this, or?
Yeah, I totally agree with your explanation. Unfortunately, that was a big misconception that if you want to reduce your social jet lag, you should just wake up early on free days. That is not the way to do it. And doing that would mean that you are sleep deprived 7 days a week. And sleep deprivation has a big impact also on your health. And so indeed, what we do on free days is usually to catch up for the sleep, and so that is good to do. And what one should try to do is either to change the social schedule. So like now we can start work later because we are more flexible in home office, for example. That would be a way to do it. Or one could, as I said at the very end, try to change the light exposure, because that is one of the strongest influence also on the timing of our sleep. And so if we expose ourselves, for example, to less light in the evening, especially the blue light, then we should be able to advance our sleep a little bit.
Thank you. And one more thing, in one of your studies, when you analyze these making exams, no, for in high school for the students in the afternoons, and how was this canceling the late chronotype effect on the results? Do you think we could talk? No, now I'm talking from a sociology of education perspective. Do you think we could talk about chronotype inequality in school performance? We should really take it more seriously, no? And also start talking about this chronotype inequality, which is due to biological fundaments and not, no, because in many things related to school and also to pedagogy and also to sometimes even to medicine, no? There is, I think, from my point of view, maybe the formation from a sociologist, but often there is a lot of impetus in putting the responsibility on the individual. So you should try to go to bed early. You should try to wake up early. If you don't do it, it's because you are lazy, or you are not strict enough with yourself. No? And when you start reading about the biological grounds, then you start understanding that maybe it's really going against the nature of the individual trying to especially adolescents, no? Try to go to school, to high school at 8 in the morning, right? And then it makes you think also, now that some people have it easier because they probably are earlier chronotype, especially there is also an interesting difference between boys and girls in this age, no? Boys tend to be even later chronotype, and this could also be behind also on the difference in the school performance, no? At least a part of it, no? And yeah, if you could elaborate a little bit more on this, on your point of view.
Yeah, well, I would say I agree with you. And you know, chronotype is like it's a biological characteristics because it has to do with sleep, and so it's like height and weight. There's a normal distribution, and even here, it seems that even we are not really targeting the middle of the distribution. We early school starting times we target the early part of the distribution, so a relatively small part of the school population. And yeah, it's also interesting to think maybe for sociologists, why is early good? Because there are these saying like the early bird catches the worm. You know, and interestingly in the history I found an article from 1913, a very old one, so 100 years ago, where they were comparing sleep in the US and in Germany. And at that time schools in the US were starting around 9 and in Germany around 8, and they already noticed that in the US students were sleeping longer. So there was already this notion that early school starting times maybe are not so good. And then in the US they moved, I don't know why, but they moved school starting times very early, so 7:30. And actually this movement to delay school starting times started in the US because these school starting times were so early. And now they suggest to start at least at 8:30 or later. Yeah, so it's interesting. I don't know, inequality is a big word, but that's what we notice actually, that's what we see. And it's quite consistent, this result that late chronotypes obtain lower growth, especially in the morning. So maybe scheduling the exams also later in the day would be a solution. Starting schools a little bit later, but you know, then you also have sometimes students who don't want to be at school that late in the day because after school they have their private time. So it's a difficult thing to solve.
Sure, it's complex also. I mean, here for the case of Spain, what we notice is that we have also a big amount of homeworks and a lot of aid to go into private academies and private tutors. So all those things happen in the afternoons. So in the end, there is an interesting debate because we are talking about making the school in the morning so people can go to the other schools in the afternoon, which is part of a complex picture, but very interesting. So,
yeah, another option is, I know in the Netherlands, for example, there are schools that have the core subjects taught in the middle of the day, where all the students have to be present at school, and then these flexible times where you can do homework, for example, and then you can choose whether you want to do it early in the morning or later in the afternoon, and then you leave the choice to the students, and they can maybe listen to their chronotype and to their sleep needs, and then decide whether they want to go at 8 in the morning or stay longer at school in the afternoon.
Yeah, I think this makes very sense. I think something I have also repeated in some of the speaks that I have been giving in schools, that the actual tendency for people really want nowadays, I think, is more and more flexibility and be able to adapt the things. And I think the school also should be focusing more into giving this flexibility of learning times. Also in the day, as you are mentioning, but also by a study of Cebolla, they also proved that there was an effect of age on the grades. So children who were born later in the year, they tend to have lower grades than children who are born at the beginning of the year. And this is, of course, an effect of maturation. But it's an effect of maturation that the school system doesn't know how to address. If there is clear effect on this, it's because you are doing the same thing regardless of the age of the student. No? And I think we should, yeah, and this is part of my will, no? That we are able to also deal with what goes on also inside the school and on how the pedagogical approach to the learning of students is more adapted to their real nature. No? And I think this your work and your presentation today is a very good hint on this direction. And I thank you very much that you can you can connect with us and share your research. And if there is no more questions, I think we can. You would like to say something more? If not, then we could make a.
No. Thank you very much for the attention and for the interesting questions.